Right now, over 75% of Fortune 500 companies hold highly classified kidnapping and ransom insurance policies for their top executives.
Yeah, and the absolute kicker there, the covered executives themselves are almost never allowed to know those policies actually exist.
Which is wild. And I mean, we are going to dig into the fascinating psychological reasons why that is a bit later on, but it really highlights this massive blind spot we all have, when looking at the modern world.
Oh, for sure. We tend to view global supply chains as this simple, rigid engineering. You press a button, a product gets manufactured, and bam, it arrives at your door.
Right, like magic. But the reality is, it's this incredibly fragile, high-stakes ecosystem that's basically balancing on a razor's edge.
The invisible web of dependencies surrounding us is just staggering. I mean, getting a single product onto a shelf requires 1,000 different variables to align perfectly.
And often across dozens of borders and completely different legal jurisdictions, right?
Exactly. And the moment you start actually mapping those connections, the vulnerabilities become terrifyingly obvious.
So the SCACA supply chain research we're doing a deep dive into today, it illustrates this by scaling from the microscopic all the way to the macroscopic. Think about just a simple street food cart.
Yeah, the street vendor example in the text is great.
Right. Even a tiny one-person operation faces constant operational threats. You've got spoilage, sudden weather shifts, a new competitor parking literally across the street, or maybe the vendor just catches the flu.
And when you scale that single cart's vulnerabilities up to a massive multinational enterprise, the stakes become almost unimaginable.
Oh, yeah. The sources highlight this major U.S. retailer that had the credit and debit card data of, 70 million customers stolen?
70 million, yeah. And that catastrophic financial and reputational damage, it didn't even come from a direct assault on their main server.
Right, it was through the supply chain.
Exactly. It came through a vulnerability at the very edge of their physical supply chain, using point-of-sale malware. It really forces leaders to confront this harsh reality that an enterprise's armor is only as thick as its weakest third-party vendor.
But, we aren't just here today to list all the terrifying things that can destroy a global conglomerate.
No, definitely not.
The actual mission of this deep dive is to explore the science of anticipating those disasters. We are unpacking the entire risk management process, the architectural frameworks that hold global commerce together, and some of the specific, honestly bizarre threats lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, everything from international honey smuggling to the literal weaponization of intellectual property.
It's crazy. But risk management at this level, it's fundamentally about building a resilient, adaptable machine, isn't it?
It is. A system designed to take a massive hit, absorb all that kinetic energy from the disruption, and just keep producing. But before an organization can build those defenses, they have to quantify exactly what danger actually is.
Right. They have to decide mathematically how much chaos they're willing to stomach.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the text fundamentally redefines the word risk. In everyday conversation, risk is just synonymous with danger.
Right. We think of fires, theft, going bankrupt.
But in supply chain management, risk isn't inherently negative. Risk is simply defined as uncertainty.
That's a huge paradigm shift for a lot of people. It's a measure of variance from an expected outcome. So negative uncertainty is a threat. Those are the things that keep executives awake at night.
But positive uncertainty is an opportunity.
Precisely.
It's like hitting up a highly rated, incredibly authentic, but maybe potentially sketchy street food market.
I love this analogy.
Right. So the threat, the negative uncertainty, is that you contract incredibly aggressive food poisoning.
Which nobody wants.
No. But the opportunity, the positive uncertainty, is that you discover the absolute best meal of your entire life. You literally cannot access the opportunity without absorbing the uncertainty.
That's a perfect way to put it. But I have to imagine that when you're dealing with $1 billion semiconductor supply chain, you can't just operate on a street food intuition.
Yeah, definitely not. Organizations have to formalize their relationship with that uncertainty. And the sources break this strategic posture down into 3 descending levels.
Right, starting at the very top with risk appetite. This is the overarching macro-level attitude of the board of directors.
So give us an example of how that looks in practice.
Well, take an IT firm racing to bring a new AI hardware chip to market. If that chip only has a 6-month life cycle before it's obsolete, they have to be aggressively risk-seeking. They embrace high uncertainty to capture those massive, fleeting profit margins.
That makes sense.
But conversely, a pharmaceutical company must have an incredibly low risk appetite. I mean, a tainted batch of raw active ingredients doesn't just mean a missed quarterly target.
It means federal lawsuits and lost lives.
Exactly. The appetite has to match the reality of the industry.
But appetite is really just a general corporate vibe, right? Saying we are risk-averse sounds great in a press release, but it doesn't actually tell a procurement manager on the ground what to do.
Which brings us to the second tier, risk tolerance.
Right.
Risk tolerance is where that philosophy meets reality. It's the organization's readiness to accept a specific negative outcome to achieve a specific objective.
Okay, so how is that different from appetite?
Well, a company with a highly risk-averse appetite overall might still tolerate, say, a high degree of delivery time risk if they are sourcing a super rare component. But they do that provided they maintain an absolute zero-tolerance policy for quality defect.
I see. It's the situational customization of the overarching appetite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which trickles down into the third term, which is the risk threshold.
And this is the concrete numerical tripwire, right?
Yes. The threshold is the exact metric where a proactive response is triggered.
So, like, if a shipping delay passes exactly 48 hours, the threshold is breached, and an automated protocol routes the freight to an air carrier instead.
Exactly. But here's the challenge. How does a giant decentralized company actually enforce this? A board of directors in Chicago setting a low risk tolerance is totally meaningless if the warehouse manager in Brazil doesn't interpret those words the exact same way.
Right, that gap between the boardroom and the warehouse floor is where organizations completely collapse.
It's the most dangerous space in the company.
So to bridge it, they implement a formal risk management plan. This document translates all that abstract philosophy into hard budgets, standardized reporting structures, and concrete thresholds.
It guarantees that the manager in Brazil and the executives in Chicago are literally measuring danger using identical operational rulers.
A unified language for danger, I like that. But a philosophy and a plan still require a physical architecture to house them?
Right. They do. And the source material outlines these massive global frameworks that companies use to build their enterprise defenses.
Because you don't want to invent a methodology from scratch if you don't have to.
Exactly. One of the most prominent ones is SCOERM. That's the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations Enterprise Risk Management Framework.
Catchy name.
Right. But it's an 8-component system designed specifically to ensure that the tone at the top actually governs daily risk-taking.
So it covers everything from the internal control environment, which is like the actual ethics and integrity of the staff, all the way down to objective setting, event identification, and continuous monitoring.
Yeah, it basically acts like an organizational nervous system. And then you have GRC, which stands for governance, risk, and compliance.
The text visualizes this as a 3-legged stool, which I thought was a really helpful metaphor. The mechanics of it are vital.
Definitely. Break that down for us.
Well, governance is the brain. It's the oversight and the strategic direction. Then risk management is the muscle. That's the actual methodology used to identify, analyze, and mitigate the threats.
And the third leg?
Compliance is the immune system. It's the rigid conformity to external laws, regulations, and binding contracts.
And the point of the stool metaphor is that if any one of those legs fractures, the entire enterprise loses its balance and tips over.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. The sources dive deep into the ISO 31000 family of risk management standards.
Oh, yes, the global blueprint.
Right. It outlines 11 core principles for managing risk. But the text explicitly notes that you actually cannot get certified in ISO 31000.
Which usually confuses people.
Totally, because corporate culture is utterly obsessed with certifications. They love paying for shiny badges to slap on annual reports just to impress shareholders.
Oh, absolutely.
So if there is no certificate at the end of this incredibly grueling implementation process, why do companies spend tens of millions of dollars adopting it?
What's fascinating here is that the true ROI of ISO 31000 is interoperability during a catastrophe. One of its supplemental standards is ISO Guide 73, which provides a unified, standardized risk vocabulary.
Basically a global dictionary for disaster.
Precisely. Imagine a massive supply chain shock, say, a sudden geopolitical embargo or a localized tsunami. You have a raw material supplier in Germany, a primary manufacturer in Mexico, and a retail distributor in Japan.
Okay, so 3 completely different corporate cultures and languages.
Right. And if they are all using different internal metrics to describe the severity or the triggering event or the financial impact, Well, the resulting miscommunication will paralyze the entire response.
Because everyone is arguing over what a level 3 threat actually means.
Exactly. But by adopting ISO Guide 73, those three distinct entities are speaking the exact same operational language. The standard strips away all that friction of translation when seconds literally cost millions of dollars.
Wow. Okay, so a universal framework makes perfect sense. But an empty framework doesn't protect you from anything until you populate it with the actual threats.
Right, you need data.
So how do organizations actively hunt for vulnerabilities they can't even see yet?
They deploy specific identification tools to essentially bypass human bias. Brainstorming is common, obviously, as is SWOT analysis, weighing internal strengths and weaknesses against external opportunities and threats.
Sure.
But the psychological mechanics of the Delphi technique are particularly powerful here.
Oh, the Delphi technique is brilliant. In a standard corporate brainstorming session, you usually get what's called the Hippio effect.
The highest paid person's opinion?
Exactly. The loudest voice or the executive with the most power totally dominates the room. Subordinates naturally self-censor because, nobody wants to look their CEO in the eye and call their new pet project a massive, unmitigated liability.
It's career suicide. So the Delphi technique dismantles that social pressure by using iterative anonymous questionnaires.
So how does that work in practice?
A facilitator collects the first round of blind responses from the experts, synthesizes the data, and sends the aggregated results back to the group for a second round.
So you see what everyone else is worried about, but without any names attached.
Yes. Participants see the collective concerns and adjust their own assessments without ever knowing who suggested what.
That's so smart. By stripping away office politics and ego, you allow a group of experts to organically converge on a highly accurate consensus of where the real dangers lie.
And once that consensus is reached, every single threat is logged into the ultimate risk management tool, which is the risk register.
The risk register, I kept picturing this as like a corporate Pokédex for disasters.
That's exactly what it is. It's a massive, relentlessly updated database.
But you don't just write down like warehouse fire, because that's basically useless.
Totally useless. A risk must be exhaustively deconstructed to even enter the register. You have to define the root cause, the specific triggering event, the immediate impact, and the long-term effect.
So you're documenting the specific ignition source, the velocity the fire spread, the exact financial value of the assets in that sector, and even the name of the person responsible for the mitigation protocol.
Exactly.
That granular level of detail seems almost, obsessive.
It does, but it enforces emotional detachment. Interesting. When you dissect a risk that thoroughly, you can plot it on a probability and impact matrix. You just multiply the mathematical likelihood of the event by the financial cost of the damage.
So if an event has a 5% probability of occurring and a $10 million impact, the expected monetary value is $500,000.
Right. That cold math dictates exactly how much capital you deploy to mitigate it. When a crisis looms, human beings panic. Probability matrices don't.
Right. Leaders just look at the register and execute the math.
Yeah.
So let's open up that register and actually look at the threat roster.
Let's do it.
The sources categorize these monsters into two main camps: tangible risks you can physically touch and intangible risks that exist entirely on paper.
Starting with the tangible side, that involves the physical loss of goods, natural disasters, theft, vandalism.
And a massive component of managing that physical loss relies on Incoterms.
Right.
Yes, the international commercial terms. These dictate the exact geographical moment the financial liability for a shipment transfers from the seller to the buyer.
It is wild how much liability swings on just a single word in a contract. Like if a cargo ship sinks in a typhoon, who actually absorbs the financial devastation?
Well, it depends on the terms. If the contract was negotiated as FOB-free on-board origin, the buyer assumed all the risk the second that container was loaded onto the vessel at the departure port.
So the buyer is literally paying for goods currently sitting at the bottom of the ocean.
Yes, they take the hit. But if the contract was FOB destination, the seller holds that massive financial risk until the container actually arrives at the buyer's loading dock.
It's all in the fine print.
Yeah.
But tangible risks also include malfeasance, right? Like intentional systemic wrongdoing.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources detail this fascinating case study involving a U.S. honey importer that perfectly illustrates how attempting to avoid one risk can inadvertently trigger a fatal one.
Right. This U.S. company was importing Chinese honey, but they wanted to dodge the heavy tariffs. that were basically crushing their profit margins.
So to avoid that financial risk, two executives orchestrated an elaborate international smuggling ring.
Which is just wild for a honey company. They routed the honey through multiple intermediary countries, forged the documentation, and relabeled the drums to obscure the true country of origin.
Yeah, they temporarily mitigated their financial margin risk, but the cost was an existential compliance failure.
Because they got caught.
Oh, they got caught. The fraud was uncovered, the executives faced criminal charges, the company absorbed millions in fines, their fraudulent inventory was seized and destroyed, and the resulting civil lawsuits forced the entire enterprise into bankruptcy.
The mitigation strategy literally killed the host.
Exactly.
And speaking of existential threats, the text highlights a tangible risk that completely caught me off guard. Abduction.
Yes.
It's a brutal operational reality for global enterprises operating in volatile regions.
It really is. The kidnap and ransom industry generates billions of dollars globally. And like you mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies hold K&R insurance policies.
But the game theory behind keeping those policies a secret from the executives they cover, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
You would think a company would want their VP of logistics to feel safe when traveling to a high-risk manufacturing hub.
You'd think so, but in risk management, information is a vulnerability.
How so?
Well, if a criminal syndicate discovers that a specific multinational has a guaranteed multi-million-dollar ransom payout just sitting there ready to deploy, every single executive in that company instantly becomes a high-value target.
Oh, wow. They basically paint a bullseye on their own people.
Exactly. And conversely, the moral hazard applied to the executive is equally dangerous.
Moral hazard.
Yeah. If an executive knows they are fully insured for ransom, human psychology dictates they will subconsciously act more recklessly.
Oh, I see. They might bypass expensive security details or ignore travel protocols because they assume the corporate safety net will just catch them.
Right. So the optimal risk response is absolute secrecy, combined with mandatory evasive driving and hostage survival training.
Man, corporate logistics is way more intense than I thought. But, okay, from the visceral reality of abduction, we need to pivot to the intangible risks.
These are the threats you cannot physically touch, yet they can hollow out a company's valuation literally overnight.
We are talking about intellectual property patents, source code, and proprietary engineering.
In the modern economy, a global supply chain is basically just a massive distribution network for ideas.
Yeah.
And those ideas are incredibly vulnerable to IP theft, often through what's called the gray market.
Okay, so a gray market is when legitimate branded goods are sold outside of the brand's authorized controlled channels, right?
Exactly. But the sources point out how gray markets actively poison legitimate supply chains.
Yeah, how does that happen?
It usually happens during component shortages. Say, a legitimate Tier 2 supplier falls behind on production. To avoid losing their contract, they quietly source components from an unauthorized, unvetted third party on the gray market, and then pass those parts off to the buyer as genuine.
So counterfeit, substandard parts are injected directly into a legitimate supply chain, completely degrading the final product's quality.
And destroying consumer trust in the brand.
But counterfeiters aren't the only intangible threat. You also have to defend against the legal system itself being weaponized by patent assertion entities.
More commonly known as patent trolls.
Right. These are shell companies that produce absolutely nothing. They don't invent, they don't manufacture.
They simply hoard vast portfolios of incredibly vague patents, often bought from bankrupt tech firms.
And they wait in the shadows until a legitimate manufacturer innovates a new piece of supply chain software or hardware, and then they strike.
Right. They file aggressive, crippling infringement lawsuits, claiming the new technology violates a broadly worded patent written like a decade before the technology even existed.
It's basically legal extortion.
It is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that supply chain defense requires far more than just physical security. You aren't just putting better locks on your shipping containers anymore.
You are engaged in high-level legal maneuvering across completely different sovereign legal systems.
Because the geopolitical reality is a massive variable here. The text contrasts U.S. intellectual property law, which leans heavily on constitutional protections and complex court battles, with the regulatory environment in China.
Right. China operates under a strict first-to-file trademark legal framework.
Which is completely different.
Which means whoever files the trademark paperwork with the Chinese government first legally owns that brand within their borders.
It completely ignores global context.
Yeah. Your company could have spent 30 years building a prestigious brand in Europe, But if you don't file the paperwork in China, a local factory can literally file it tomorrow.
And then they own your trademark.
Exactly. And they could legally manufacture products under your name or just hold your brand hostage until you pay a massive settlement to buy it back.
It demands incredibly aggressive, proactive compliance. Organizations must map their future operational footprint and file intellectual property protections in foreign jurisdictions years before they ever plan to source a single component from them.
It really is a high-stakes chess match. So bringing it all back, what does this all mean? We have scaled from a street food vendor worried about rain to multinational conglomerates fighting invisible shell companies in court, using unified global vocabularies to survive typhoons.
Well, the ultimate takeaway from the source material is that supply chain risk management is not an exercise in pessimism. It's really a discipline of structural resilience.
By clearly defining their risk appetite, anchoring their operations in architectural frameworks like CSCP and ISO 31000, and stripping all the emotion out of their risk registers.
Organizations transform the terrifying chaos of the global market into manageable mathematical equations.
They figure out exactly which hits they can absorb and engineer a plan for the ones they simply can't.
Exactly. And, that framework of defining and measuring uncertainty applies far beyond corporate logistics.
Oh, totally.
The sources focus heavily on how organizations hunt for known risks and reserve capital for the unknown unknowns. But consider this on an individual level.
Okay.
If you were forced to build a personal risk register for your own career or your financial life right now, applying the exact same rigorous, emotionless math, what is the one unlikely but catastrophic event you are completely ignoring simply because it hasn't happened to you yet?
Wow.
Are you actively managing the variance in your life, or are you just operating without a net and hoping you get lucky?
That is a phenomenal question to end on, because if it isn't quantified in the register, you aren't managing it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the hidden systems operating all around you, and we will catch you next time.